Pray with me. Lord, I pray that you would use my words to speak to all of us, that you would move us to obedience and to worship of you. Through Jesus, amen. You may be seated. I want to know how many of you tomorrow morning will be waking up singing about going down Moses in the morning. I love that hymn. So I'm going to do something risky here in this sermon. And some of you potentially might doze off. I know it doesn't happen, but you might let your mind wander, and then you just start to dial back in just at the time that I tell you that you should be more like those Israelites who made an idol. Okay, so before we go much further, and while I still have your attention, I want you to know I have a specific point that I will be making. And you need to hear the whole argument, okay, to understand what I'm saying. So be careful. Our Old Testament reading is known as the Golden Calf Incident, and it is a relatively familiar story of rebellion, mediation, and then restoration. So that rebellion piece is pretty easy to see. Leading up to chapter 32 of Exodus, which, by the way, is on page 72 in your blue Bibles. I encourage you to turn there. Exodus has been going into great detail about the proper worship and the building of the tabernacle. God was revealing to his people exactly how he should be worshiped. And it's important stuff. The building of the tabernacle to exact specifications is a display for all the world to see that God takes the initiative to be in the presence of his people, but that God is also particular with how worship goes. When you are the creator of the universe, you get to decide how people worship you, and God has every right to do that. But now as the narrative picks back up again, we see that Moses has been listening to God up there on the mountain, while the people down below, well, they were getting restless. They missed their Moses, their only mediator between God and humans. So what do people do when their sinful nature gets the upper hand? They rebel, of course. Verse 1 reveals the people's impatience, threatening to unravel God's entire plan that has been in place since Genesis 12. So here is verse 1. Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, and the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, "Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what has become of him." Now, there is no deliberation, there is no plotting, there is no indication, at least from what we know, as to what actually motivates the Israelites to do what they did. Moses' delay brought out their impatience, and then accusations of abandonment. They claim, "We don't know what has become of this Moses." They speak of Moses with derision and even contempt. And then they compel Aaron to step in for them. Aaron fashions a calf out of gold and then asserts that, well, this is the God that brought you out of Egypt. The crazy thing to consider is that this is an attempt to undo what has just been taking place in the preceding 31 chapters of Exodus. The book starts with their escape from slavery, just as the hymn said. And the Egyptian gods escaped from them too, through the wilderness wanderings and right up to the making of a covenant and the initiation of God's presence in the tabernacle. Now, we don't know for sure what motivated them, but the Hebrew gives us a hint and clues that their request was actually more like a threat. See, the Israelites gathered against, that's in the Hebrew, that they gathered against Aaron, so that this is not a friendly coming with a request, it's really a hostile group threatening Aaron into compliance. That kind of lets Aaron off the hook, not entirely in my mind, but you see a little bit more why he would do such an outrageous thing. But now let's talk about this calf for a minute. By insisting on worshiping the golden calf, the Israelites adopt a pagan representation of God, who had already demonstrated in no uncertain terms his mastery over all those pagan gods of Egypt. The choice of a calf is not arbitrary either. It was a common idol image in ancient times. But the thing we need to understand is that the ancient people do not actually equate an idol with the god, but it's more like an earthly representation of that god. And even though that calves and bulls are often will function more as a pedestal. Okay, so they understand that it was a pedestal for the gods who are either seated on them or standing over them. And in a sense, the calf is similar to the Ark of the Covenant. So this is important to remember because it's unlikely that the calf itself is being declared a god, as if they actually think that it brought them out of Egypt. Rather, in their mind, God is enthroned above a golden calf. And by making a golden calf, they were ensuring God's presence with them, or so they thought. With this understanding, we realize that Israel is not breaking the first commandment. They are breaking the second commandment of not having graven images, and especially gold images. If you read Exodus 20, you'll see, don't make gold images in the like birds and animals and things like that. And that's exactly what they're doing. Now, perhaps it's hard to relate to golden idols as being somehow, enticing. It's easy to see false gods in another culture, a culture not our own. I saw this when we lived in Turkey for more than a decade. I had different values. I saw things differently. And even at the point where I could understand Turkish, and it was good enough for me to catch what's going on, the TV commercials, the messages that were being pumped at me, it didn't compel me to buy their product because it wasn't designed to entice me to begin with. It was designed to entice the Turkish society. So I could be more removed and say, that's silly. But my question is, why were the people of God so intent on ensuring that they had a mediator between God and themselves? And the corollary question, why do people nowadays often not care at all about having access to God? People seem to be perfectly content to go along their merry way. See, the calf represents an alternative point of contact between God and people. And as Christians, our first reaction is to the golden image is condemnation. We just want to push this away. It seems so obvious. It seems so straightforward that they are sinning, and in a big way. But really, what if there is more going on here? In other words, besides rebellion, that's pretty clear, and an attempt to reject the gods of Israel so that they can join the pagan gods of the surrounding people, there's actually more. And it's the issue of mediator. So Moses had been the only means of contact that Israel's had with God. He was indispensable to them. And it's kind of easy for us to forget that since we are living at the time of Jesus. We have Jesus, right? He is our mediator. The supernatural presence of Jesus, the ministry of the Holy Spirit is so much more sure. We can count on that, count on them for us to be connected to God. And in a sense, the tabernacle was always going to be temporary until the day that we are reconciled to God through Jesus. In fact, if we look back 10 chapters in Exodus, it was Israel's own request that Moses act as a buffer. Exodus 20:19 says, you, as in you, Moses, you speak to us and we will listen. But do not let God speak to us, lest we die. So they're saying they want someone to speak for them, for God, because they are just too afraid for God to speak directly to them. Now, as Christians nowadays, the perfect mediator, of course, is Jesus. And it's really kind of easy to forget how far away God seemed to this everyday person. No, people expect a Moses to stand in the gap between God and the people. And when there's too much silence from God, well, that's scary. And what if we're doing it wrong? They're worried. So the people told themselves, and because of that, they panicked. With the delay, they sensed themselves losing touch with God. But truth be told, even that's hard for us to relate to. It seems the way we mostly live our lives for much of the time, that's exactly the situation those Israelites found themselves in, out of touch with God. But what if the early Israelites knew something that we do not? So this is where I make the crazy point that maybe we should be a little bit more like those Israelites. Like I said at the beginning, pay attention to the subtlety here. I'm not encouraging you to get frustrated and then worship a god of your own making. Okay, you hear that? I'm not encouraging that. What I mean is, what if we actually cared about being disconnected from God? What if we cared enough about that? Even cared enough to do something about it? Like, let me think, join a home group. That's an idea. Or better yet, lead a home group. You were waiting for me to give an advertisement about that, I know, because you know me. So we see the Israelites panicking because they think they have lost their contact with God. And it's more than simply missing Moses, because he was the mediator with God. But I wonder, is any of that anxiety actually good? If we are skeptics, we might be quite used to living our lives disconnected from God. We might be used to calling those religious types, well, they're just naive. And what if we recognize that there really is more to this world than meets the eye? Sure, in the past, people had erroneous beliefs that have since been disproven. Yes, scientific discoveries have had a tremendous impact, but as wonderful as science is, our discoveries can never answer all of life's deepest questions. So you see, I'm not advocating for panic in the way the ancient Hebrews did, but what if we actually cared about being disconnected from God and cared enough to do something about it? What if we actually know when we are lost? What if we are that lost sheep of the gospel reading today that recognizes their lostness and then makes a loud ruckus until he or she is found? And when we look further on in the passage, we see how important it is to have a mediator. Notice what Moses does for his people when faced with this impending disaster. So I'm picking up again in verse 9. God says, I've seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now, therefore, let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you, Moses. But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, Oh, Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should those Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember, Abraham, Isaac, Israel, your servants. See, this is effective mediation that Moses did for his people, and the people were restored to right relationship with God. The Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people. And thanks be to God, we have a perfect mediator who will not leave us as lost sheep or lost coins or lost panicky Israelites either. Thanks be to God. Amen.